It is the night of the 23rd of October, 1942, somewhere behind the British lines at El Alamein, Egypt. A line of lorries crawls along a dusty track in the moonlight, engines grumbling, headlamps blacked out. To any German reconnaissance pilot watching from above, they are exactly what they appear to be: transport vehicles, part of the endless, tedious traffic of a desert army. But these lorries do not behave like lorries. They move too slowly. They sink too deep into the sand. And if a man were foolish enough to walk up and lean against one's canvas side panel, his hand would pass through painted fabric and touch the cold steel turret of a Crusader tank underneath. This is a Sunshield, a simple wooden and canvas frame, designed to slip over an armored vehicle and turn it, at a glance and from the air, into something utterly unthreatening. Hundreds of them are creeping into position tonight, part of a deception so vast and so carefully engineered that it will help decide the fate of an entire campaign. Within hours, nearly 900 British guns will open fire along this front, and the German and Italian forces dug in opposite them will discover, far too late, that almost everything they believed about the coming battle was a lie. Their reserves are in the wrong place. Their generals are confused about the date. Their senior commander on the field that night will not survive what comes next. What unfolds at El Alamein over the following days will become one of the turning points of the Second World War, and a great deal of the credit belongs not to tanks or to firepower, but to a campaign of organized, industrial-scale trickery that convinced Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army to prepare for a battle that was never coming, in a place it would never be fought. The British did not simply outfight the Afrika Korps that autumn. They outwitted it first, and the outwitting may have mattered just as much as anything that happened on the battlefield. By the summer of 1942, the war in North Africa had become a grim seesaw. Rommel's forces had pushed the British Eighth Army back almost to the gates of Egypt, capturing Tobruk in June and advancing to within 60 miles of Alexandria before being halted at the First Battle of El Alamein. For the British, the strategic stakes could hardly have been higher. Lose Egypt and the Suez Canal, the lifeline to India and the oil fields of the Middle East, would fall within reach of the Axis. Winston Churchill needed a victory, and he needed one quickly, both to secure the region and to demonstrate to a watching world and to an increasingly impatient United States that British arms could still win battles. The problem was that a frontal assault against a well-prepared defensive line offered no guarantees. Rommel's forces had spent months laying one of the densest minefields of the war, stretching for miles along the front, sown with hundreds of thousands of mines interspersed with booby traps. Montgomery's Eighth Army, newly arrived and newly confident, had the numbers, with roughly 195,000 men against around 116,000 Axis troops, and a substantial advantage in tanks and aircraft. But numbers alone had failed the British before in this desert war. What Rommel lacked in materiel, he had repeatedly made up for with speed, instinct, and an uncanny ability to read his opponent's intentions and strike at the weak point before the British were ready. Montgomery understood that brute strength would not be enough. If Rommel correctly judged where and when the blow would fall, he could concentrate his limited armored reserves at exactly the right place and blunt the attack regardless of the disparity in numbers. The British needed Rommel to look the wrong way at the critical moment. They needed him to believe the attack would come weeks later than planned, and miles away from where it would actually fall. Conventional camouflage, simply hiding things, would not achieve this. Hiding an army of this size in flat, open desert, watched constantly by German aerial reconnaissance, was effectively impossible. The British would have to do something considerably more ambitious. Rather than make their preparations invisible, they would have to make them lie. The man tasked with engineering that lie was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson, a staff officer with no previous experience in deception planning, who was warned bluntly that a failed deception would do more damage than no plan at all. Working from the outline supplied by Montgomery's chief of staff, Freddy de Guingand, Richardson built what became known as Operation Bertram, a deception plan to convince Rommel's command that the main assault would come in the south of the line, roughly 20 miles from where Montgomery actually intended to strike along the coast road in the north, and that it would not begin for some time yet. The physical work of building the illusion fell to the British Middle East Command Camouflage Directorate, led by Geoffrey Barkas, working out of a school at Helwan near Cairo alongside the architect Tony Ayrton and the artist Brian Robb. Their toolkit blended theatrical set design with military engineering. The Sunshield itself, the canvas and frame disguise that turned a tank into a lorry from above, had originated from a handwritten note by General Archibald Wavell, who sketched the idea and asked simply whether it might work. Barkas's team turned the sketch into a manufactured reality, and by the time of the battle, 722 Sunshields had been issued to disguise the very armor that would lead the real attack. The deception ran on a kind of nightly choreography. Tanks of the 10th Armored Corps moved at night from their staging area to their true jumping-off position, codenamed Martello, arriving and disguising themselves as innocuous trucks before first light. Back at the now empty staging ground, engineers erased the tank tracks in the sand, gathered up the discarded fuel cans, and erected dummy tanks in the exact spots the real ones had occupied the day before, so that German photo reconnaissance, comparing one day's images to the next, would see no change at all. In the south, where Montgomery wanted Rommel's attention fixed, an entirely fictitious buildup was constructed. Dummy guns that could be stowed inside a single lorry, fake supply dumps, and even a dummy water pipeline, codenamed Diamond, whose construction rate was deliberately calculated to suggest the British would not be ready to attack for several more weeks. Decoy artillery positions were built early and then, with a clever second layer of bluff, deliberately allowed to look tired and abandoned, so that when real artillery quietly took their place on the eve of battle, German interpreters would assume they were looking at the same harmless dummies they had already dismissed. None of this depended on stage magic, despite the enduring legend of the illusionist Jasper Maskelyne and his so-called magic gang. Maskelyne was a real figure attached to the Camouflage Directorate, and later accounts, including his own, inflated his personal role considerably. The serious engineering, the manufacturing of hundreds of dummies, the logistics of moving them, and the broader strategic deception was the work of Barkas, Ayrton, and the wider organization under Brigadier Dudley Clark, the founder of the deception unit known as A-Force, which had been refining these techniques in the desert since 1940. The whole scheme was also wrapped in an electronic layer, codenamed Operation Canwell, using false radio traffic to reinforce the story being told by the dummies on the ground, so that what German listening posts heard matched what German aircraft photographed. The manufacturing effort behind all of this was considerably larger than the popular image of a handful of magicians and artists working quietly in a Cairo workshop. Barkas was given 3 complete pioneer companies, a transport company, and a unit of prisoners of war to help with the physical labor, and overall the deception required something in the region of 400 dummy Grant tanks and close to 2,000 dummy transport vehicles and field guns, built from plywood, canvas, and scrap timber and assembled at a dedicated school at Helwan, near Cairo. The frames were light enough for small teams to carry and erect under cover of darkness, yet bulky enough once draped in painted canvas to throw a convincing shadow and silhouette from the altitude a German reconnaissance aircraft would be flying. Maintaining the illusion was a constant, almost theatrical task. Officers staged dummy vehicles outside fake canteens, arranged smoke rising from imaginary cookhouses, and even had men sit inside the painted shells of trucks pretending to brew tea, so that an aerial photograph would show not just hardware but the ordinary lived-in texture of a real army camp. Within roughly 3 weeks of starting the southern buildup, Barkas's team had created enough visible activity to suggest the presence of 2 entire fresh motorized divisions that did not exist. The deception was tested almost immediately by reality. On the night of October 23, 1942, as nearly 1,000 British guns opened a barrage that lasted, with a brief pause, around 20 minutes before the infantry began advancing through the Axis minefields. The German command structure was in disarray for reasons the deception planners could not have engineered themselves, but which compounded its effect. Rommel himself was not in Egypt, having returned to Germany on medical leave, and command had passed to General Georg Stumme, who reportedly believed the attack would not begin for several more weeks, exactly as Operation Bertram intended him to think. On the night of the barrage, Stumme went forward with his signals officer on a reconnaissance toward the British lines, an ill-timed venture that placed him directly in the path of the opening bombardment. His signals officer was killed by machine gun fire, and Stumme, already worn down by the North African climate, suffered a heart attack and died. It was some time before his absence was even noticed, and roughly a full day passed before Berlin grasped the seriousness of the situation and recalled Rommel to take back command. Documented evidence from the German side, drawn from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and after-action analysis, confirms the scale of the success. An Italian intelligence map recovered after the battle placed British armored divisions in the south, in the area the deception had been designed to suggest, when in fact the real striking force was massed in the north. The captured Panzer Army General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma later told Montgomery directly that he had believed the Allies possessed at least one more armored division than they actually had, and that he expected the main attack to fall in the south. Soldiers in the northern sector, where the real blow landed, reported that the enemy appeared to know nothing of the attack until it broke upon them. Rommel himself, once he returned to take command, kept a substantial portion of his armor held back in the southern sector for the first 4 days of the battle. Armor that was desperately needed in the north, but which remained pinned in place, guarding against an attack that would never come. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans were not without their own traditions of deception, and the Wehrmacht had used camouflage, decoys, and disinformation throughout the war with real skill, from disguising armored columns during the invasion of France to elaborate radio deception on the Eastern Front. But what distinguished Operation Bertram was its sheer integration. It combined physical disguise, manufactured infrastructure, controlled degradation of decoys over time to manage enemy assumptions, and synchronized false radio traffic, all aimed at a single, specific outcome, misjudging both the place and the date of a single, decisive attack, down to a margin of roughly 20 miles and several weeks. German deception efforts in the Desert War, by comparison, tended to be more reactive and localized, lacking the centralized planning apparatus that Dudley Clark's organization had been developing since 1940. The American military, watching events in North Africa unfold, drew direct lessons from what the British had achieved. 2 American officers, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris, studied British deception methods and used them as the template for an entirely new unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, activated in January 1944 and later nicknamed the Ghost Army. That American unit would go on to use inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and false radio traffic of its own across the Western Front, from the build-up to D-Day through to the Rhine crossings in 1945, explicitly inspired by the methods British deception planners had pioneered in the desert 2 years earlier. In that sense, the trick played on Rommel's army at El Alamein did not end with the battle. It became the founding template for Allied deception for the remainder of the war. The material impact of Operation Bertram is, by its nature, difficult to separate cleanly from the broader military realities of the battle. The Eighth Army's advantages in manpower, armor, air support, and supply were substantial, and would likely have told in Britain's favor eventually, regardless of any deception. What the deception bought was something harder to quantify but arguably just as valuable: time, surprise, and the disorientation of an enemy command structure at precisely the moment it needed clarity most. Winston Churchill himself was in no doubt about its significance, telling the House of Commons after the victory that a marvelous system of camouflage had achieved complete tactical surprise in the desert, and describing how an entire corps had moved silently away in the night while leaving behind an exact simulacrum of its tanks where it had stood. The psychological dimension mattered too. An enemy commander who has been fooled once becomes a more hesitant commander afterwards, and the disorientation in the German high command in the days following Stuma's death, compounded by uncertainty about what else the British might be concealing, almost certainly slowed the German response when speed was desperately needed. The organization behind Bertram did not disband once the battle was won. Dudley Clark's A-Force went on to plan some of the most consequential deceptions of the entire war, lending its experience and many of its personnel to the schemes that would later protect the invasions of Sicily and Normandy. The lesson the British had proven in the desert, that an enemy could be made not merely blind but actively wrong, fed directly into the much larger architecture of deception that culminated in 1944. It is a reasonable case that without the practical experience earned at El Alamein, refining how dummies, radio traffic, and controlled timing could work together to plant a specific false belief in an enemy commander's mind, the later triumphs of deception planning that helped secure the Normandy beachhead might have looked very different, or arrived too late to matter. Few physical traces of Operation Bertram survive today in the way a tank or an aircraft might. The Sunshields themselves were simple wood and canvas, built to be used once and then discarded or recycled, and none are known to have survived intact. What remains is documentary. Official histories, the recollections of men like Barkas and Ayrton, captured German reports now held in archives, and the wider historical record of A-Force's operations, which continued to influence deception planning for the rest of the war, feeding directly into the far larger schemes of Operation Mincemeat and Operation Fortitude that would help disguise the Allied invasions of Sicily and Normandy. Return, for a moment, to that line of lorries crawling through the moonlight on the night of the 23rd of October. Each one a lie wrapped around a truth, a tank pretending to be nothing of consequence, inching toward a battle line where an entire army was about to discover that it had been looking in the wrong direction for weeks. The guns that opened up minutes later were real. The casualties that followed were real. But the conditions that made the attack possible, the misplaced reserves, the confused timetable, the commander caught in the open at the worst possible moment, were built not from steel but from canvas, plywood, false tracks in the sand, and a great deal of patient, unglamorous work by camouflage officers most people have never heard of. There is a peculiar kind of courage in that work, one that earns no medals and leaves no wreckage to photograph. Geoffrey Barkas and his team did not storm a position or hold a line under fire. They built a story, detail by detail, and trusted that an enemy army would believe it. They were right. Rommel's Panzer Army, one of the most feared fighting forces in the world, prepared for a battle that did not exist, in a place the British had no intention of attacking, on a date that had already passed before the real one came. By the time the truth became clear, the line had already broken, the commander on the ground was already dead, and the long retreat that would eventually carry German and Italian forces out of Egypt, out of Libya, and ultimately out of North Africa altogether had already begun. Consider what that retreat actually cost the men who believed the lie. Soldiers held armor in reserve to meet an attack that was never coming. Officers studied maps that placed British divisions in empty desert. A field marshal returned from sick leave to find his command already unraveling, undone before he had fired a shot in response. None of them had been outfought in any conventional sense when the deception first took hold. They had simply been told a story, persuasively enough that they organized an entire defense around events that did not exist. It was not magic, whatever Jasper Maskelyne might later have claimed. It was something more remarkable still. Ordinary canvas and wood, arranged with extraordinary care, that convinced a professional army to defend the wrong ground at the wrong time. The desert kept few souvenirs of what was done there that October, but it kept the result. An army that thought it knew where the blow would fall and was wrong. A battle that began in confusion and ended in retreat. And a trick, quietly devised in a camouflage school outside Cairo that helped change the course of the war in North Africa before a single shot had been fired in anger.